Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome to Rappin With ReefBum. I am your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and each episode I interview a guest from the reef keeping community. And today I welcome Joe Peck. Joe, I'm calling you a reef keeper extraordinaire, and Joe has an amazing reef tank that has actually been featured on Advanced Aquarist, a online publication for Reefs.com. It was also featured at a tank spotlight on Reef to Reef, and his tank was Tank of the Month on Reef Central, a trifecta. Joe, welcome to the show. All right, I got to do a little thing here because I'm not seeing you come on the screen. So let me just fiddle a little bit here with the. Why are we not seeing you there? Hang on, folks. We got it. There we go. Now we can see you. Joe, can you speak there so we can hear you for a second?
Yeah, now I have a message that I can record this broadcast, or you are broadcasting me. So I think you must have done something.
Yeah, well, we got you now. So, all right, Joe, let's do that again. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. You know, one other thing you probably didn't know about this, but I was also, I don't know if you can see this, but I was featured on the cover of a magazine years ago. That's my Anemone from a long time ago, splitting. But I wrote an article and took some pictures. So about the same time that I got the Tank of the Month, I also got, I was fortunate enough to be on the cover of a magazine.
Well, that's awesome. And so, Joe, you and I have known each other. We've been reef keeping friends for many, many years. I think we were talking about this before the show. It might have been back in 2008, maybe 2007. I don't know. Maybe we met through Chris Jensen at Reef and Fin in Stamford, Connecticut, or maybe Jason Edwards at Greenwich Aquaria in Greenwich, Connecticut. I can't remember. But all I remember is going to your house and seeing your fish tank, and I was truly inspired. I remember this. You had this giant colony of the Oregon blue tort and the original Tyree purple monster, and you were so generous. You gave me several frags of each, I think, at least 2 frags of each plus some other frags, and I'll never forget that. It was awesome, and it's always good to have good reef keeping friends like yourself.
Yeah, well, it's vice versa because I remember receiving numerous frags from you after that. So it's always a pay it forward kind of thing, you know. That's the way it seems the hobby works.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about this hobby is you gotta just try to make a lot of acquaintances and share knowledge and share frags and spread the wealth. So it's a great thing, and that's one of the truly great things about the hobby. So Joe, let's talk about how you got into reef keeping. I always like to ask my guests that question in terms of what your story is, in terms of how you got into the hobby. So if you would.
Yeah. So my wife and I, before we had children, we both very much enjoyed diving. We went diving all over the Pacific, Hawaii, and in the Caribbean, and Cozumel, and just did a whole lot of diving. And I was always very interested in the smaller fish. And then we found friends. We moved to Chicago for a while, and some of our friends were also into diving. And that friend had a saltwater tank in his house. I never really realized that it was even possible, and that was probably 1998 or so. So it took another 2 or 3 years before it finally gelled in my mind that I wanted to try a tank on my own. But definitely the inspiration for me came from first diving and then seeing somebody having a little bit of ocean in their room back in '98. And that gentleman also still has a tank, although he's gone to fish only. So he was never big on the coral aspect of it. That came later for me as well. So, but yeah, that's how I got started.
So Joe, I'm gonna show a picture of the of your tank many years ago, and I'm gonna bring it up right now. And it was just it was a gorgeous tank. It had a Rideri anemone, and I know that split several times. And when we were talking before, I know you mentioned that you no longer have that anemone, and we're gonna actually show a video of the tank in its current state. So why don't you explain to everybody in terms of the history of your tank? I mean, it's been through a couple of reboots, right? Haven't you had a couple of restarts along the way? And it's also a tank that you've had for a very, very long time, correct?
Correct. I mean, this particular tank that I have here is from 2007, but it transferred from another 180-gallon tank that I started really in 2001. The reboots, unfortunately, as is so often in this hobby, we all have run into the flatworm problem or the red bug problem or something like that. And my first real reboot came because I was hit with the terrible flat world of flatworms.
Yep, been
And
there.
it just devastated my tank. And I was very heartbroken. But the real positive, like we were talking about before, I was online discussing my problem, and lo and behold, 3 local gentlemen, Tony Giovanni and another 2 local reefers, they came over to my house and spent a whole day breaking down my tank, taking off each frag that they could, dipping the frags, helping me put them back onto rock that I got that was new rock, and basically reassembling the entire tank in one afternoon. So that was my first reboot. And normally it's usually been something that's happened to my tank that's caused me to have to kind of start over. But the starting over has been a lot of fun. I mean, it's always it's fun. I mean, you've done it yourself. I've seen you redo the tank, and I love. I've actually used your progression shots from your '07, '08
Yeah,
time period. I
yeah.
forget, but I've used those online many times to talk about how It's okay to, start out with the small frags and grow out these big colonies. You just have to be patient and wait, because it can turn into something spectacular if you do it
Yeah,
right.
let's talk a little about aquascaping, and we're going to get into your tank specifically in terms of the videos and stuff like that. But what's your philosophy on aquascaping?
So it's so hard at the beginning, because at the beginning, when I set up my reef, well, first of all, it never happens the first time, right? I'll do it, I'll look at it, and I'll be like, 3 weeks later, I'll move frag somewhere else, or I'll move a rock, or but the other item is that it just looks terrible because it's little sticks, and for months or years, you're looking at little sticks. But I think you're a classic example of this. I mean, the pictures you show demonstrated so well that you just have to be patient, and you have to leave space. Today, I see a lot of younger reefers getting in a hobby, and they'll buy 5 or 6 frags, and they'll put them all, right on the top of one little 6-inch rock. And I'm thinking to myself, those are gorgeous. They could be gorgeous colonies, and you have really nice high-end corals that you purchase. But man, there's no room for them to grow.
Yeah.
You gotta be willing to accept that kind of small stick spread out look in the beginning as you get started. And then the other item is, I like to, and 20 years ago this was a little harder because there weren't quite as many choices. But today, you have a lot more color choices. I like to have contrasting colors. So I like to have a deep blue in one area, an orange in another, a yellow. I don't like to get them all grouped in the same color in the same area. Now I try to get different colors of each possibility, which today the color choices are really fantastic. Just you have some wonderful corals you can buy on a regular basis. The Walt Disney coral, or you mentioned before, the Blue Oregon Tor is readily available all the time. I love the Bali green slimer. That's a really old school, very inexpensive coral, but it offers nice color, especially out of the blue LEDs these days, and gives a nice contrast to the other coral colors that you see commonly.
Yeah, it grows like a weed. In my 225-gallon tank, it actually grew out of the water. I mean, it was like
No kidding. Wow.
It literally was growing out of the water, and I had to eventually get rid of it because it was so aggressive. I'm going to show a tank that you actually visited in person, and this is Steve Weiss's tank, and it was an inspiration to you in terms of your tank. And this guy was just really, he rocked it. I mean, this guy was Steve. I don't know if he's got a tank going right now, but this was the tank that everybody drooled over years ago. And I think I see an Oregon blue tort in there, and you also, I know in terms of what I read, you visited reefstuff.com in Oregon when you were out there, and you talked to Rick Suda. So it's quite an interesting history out there in Oregon. But Steve's tank, and I'm going to show your photo as well. I definitely see some similarities there in terms of the aquascaping. But talk about that visit with Steve and that tank.
Well, first of all, Steve Weiss he's the god of gods when it comes to reef keeping. His tank, to have seen it in person, is incredible. It's as good as anything you would see in like the Monterey Aquarium or something like that. It was just truly, truly unbelievable. His big feature, he had it in one room. He had a room dedicated to that, and only the front pane was visible. You couldn't see on the sides of the tank. And he created this channel that you look down with an enormous amount of depth. Because and that was something that I really wanted to duplicate with my reef. So I tried. I didn't have anywhere near the size that he had, but my tank is 48 by 48. It's square, not long. So I thought I could get a little bit of that. And I like to think I made as best an attempt as I could with 48 by 48. But his the meticulousness of how he did it, and he said there were so many little tidbits that I picked up from other reefers along the way, and from him I picked up just an enormous amount. up until that time, I never thought of cleaning my sand bed. And he religiously cleaned his sand bed, just siphoning off the top little bit and replacing it with a little bit. He didn't like snails. He thought snails were a pollution in the tank. He used urchins. So I went back home and got urchins and didn't buy any more snails. He had some coral. He was the one who talked about coral placement and coral color and how you want to have contrasting colors. And in his back shop, the behind the scenes, the order that was in his system was something that I up to that point had not really tried to put into my system, and I went home and tried to do that. Reinforcing floors was something I hadn't thought about a whole lot before. So I just learned a lot from Steve. He was really, really very generous with his knowledge and his time, and his tank was absolutely gorgeous. And you mentioned it was also interesting because on that same visit, I did meet Rick Soda. I don't believe he's in the business. I think his son now has a shop still out there in Oregon, but he was one of the very early online retailers from whom you could buy most of the classic corals of the time. A bird's nest or a post lepora or the Oregon tort he was famous for because he had a very large colony. And he was the one who he really, really pushed on actinic light long before anybody else did. He thought that was the secret sauce to his corals being so colorful. Not just, he had the radium bulbs, the metal halide radiums, but he also had over every tank where he had where he was growing coral, he used back then it was VHO. We didn't have the T5, so it was all the VHO actinics, the super actinics. But he definitely was a very strong influence in my early choices about corals and lighting. As you said, the Oregon was kind of at the forefront at the time.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the Oregon Blue Tort is my all-time favorite SPS coral, hands down.
Yeah, I would put a close second to it the Tyree Purple Monster, and that seems to be really hard to find. And I still don't know why. My tank was very healthy, doing really well, and I had several colonies of that. And it's one of those things in our hobby. They just started turning brittle and STNing, and there was nothing. I couldn't frag it. I took it out and dipped it. I put it in another system. And it just didn't seem to survive. So I don't know. I don't know what happened with that, but I really missed that coral. And that's one that I'm actively seeking a piece of still.
Well, I have a frag that has been growing out for a couple of years, and it's really just been encrusting and encrusting and encrusting. And I've got a couple of nubs. So once I've got a fraggable branch there, Joe, I'll make sure that you get a piece of it. But it's been frustrating how long it takes for that thing. And in my prior tank, my 225-gallon tank, for me, it grew like a weed. It really just grew like a weed.
Absolutely.
And now it's I don't know, it's being a little stubborn here. But
there's many years ago, there's a guy, Ron Shimmick, on reefcentral.com. I think he was a biologist. I don't see him around anymore. But he talked about coral senescence. I think that's the correct pronunciation. Maybe I got that wrong. But he thought that maybe corals that are kept in our hobby that are the same coral, they're cloning themselves over and over and over and over. They're never reproducing sexually. And that perhaps somehow, without getting new DNA every decade or so, maybe they have a finite, ability to reproduce. I have no idea. Have no idea. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a hard coral to come by these days, and if anybody out there has a purple monster that's growing really well, I'd like to know about it. But I know John Capolino is. That's why I think I got the frag from. I know he does really well with that coral. But let's go back into your tank. So I showed that picture before in terms of what it looked like a while ago, and you shot a video for us, and you did a little narration around it. So what we'll do here is we'll play that video, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
All right.
Here we go.
Hi there, folks. Joe Peck, Too Sunny from Reef to Reef, and JP Bangyar from ReefCentral.com. Here at Keith's invitation, thank you very much, Keith, getting to show off my lifetime hobby, this reef that I set up back in 2000 originally, but this tank I got in 2007, and it's had a couple of redos since then. But this time when I redid it about 8 months ago, I started this latest version, and I went with a lot fewer coral colonies because I want to allow them to grow much bigger this time rather than a bunch of smaller colonies that get crowded quickly. And I switched, I was a lifelong believer in metal halide lights, and now I switched to the LED T5 hybrid, the ATI power modules. I cannot say enough about how much I like them. I just think the color's fantastic, and the dawn-dusk effect that you get with the blue LEDs is just really second to none. It just shows off the corals really well. And you can tell by the coloration that the corals obviously very much love the light. So let me turn the flow off and then we can get a quick look at the top. And I forgot to mention also that the flow that is in there is coming from two Tunzi units that are on the swivel. That's all I have, nothing else really. All right, that's it. So that's it for the 240 display. Let's go have a look at my Pico. I got a new 2.5 gallon Pico in the kitchen.
All right, and we are back. And before we look at that Pico tank, Joe, I got some questions for you about that. First of all, it's looking awesome. And
thanks very much. Appreciate it.
I see you guys still got a nice big chunk of that Oregon blue tort right there in that tank. And you also have a lot of, like you were talking about, some not so big name corals. You got some very basic like Stylophora, orange digi, and those are very colorful corals. And I have similar tastes. I like to mix it up. There's some definitely rare pieces that I like to keep in there, but I prefer to have a lot of bright, solid, contrasting colors in my reef tanks, and it looks like that's the same with you, and so I can relate.
Yeah, I thought it very interesting that I was very late to the LED move, but obviously the lights I have now do have the LEDs, and they turn blue at night. When I do the dawn dusk, I have the T5s off, and I was pleasantly surprised that the Bali green slimer and the orange digi, they look absolutely spectacular under the blue light. I mean, they really glow tremendously, as well as the zoanthids I have there are a very common fire and ice. They're not very fancy. But they look really, really good when the blue lights turn on. So I'm definitely a big fan of some of the nicer corals, but I'm also a big fan of like you said, some of the old school basic corals that provide that good contrast, good color.
So we have a comment from Alfredo who says, is this the Joe Peck that had the most beautiful tank I've ever seen with a magnificent anemone? I think it is, Alfredo.
I think that's the one, yes. Thank you very much, Alfredo. I appreciate that.
So what happened to the anemone?
So that one actually got too big for my tank. It did split a bunch of times. And I was lucky enough, I was very worried because I wasn't going to destroy the anemone. That wasn't going to happen. But a local fish shop, House of Fins in Greenwich Aquaria, there's a gentleman there, Keith, who has friends at the Norwalk Aquarium, and he was able to contact them, and they generously offered to take that anemone, and it's now on display in Norwalk. So, and if you go to another local fish shop, Greenwich Aquaria, which is owned by Jason Edward in Riverside, Connecticut, there actually are two clones of that anemone in that tank. I gave him a very, very small clone, like maybe that big in 2005, and now it's, now it's a good 2 feet across and a host to a couple different clown families. So,
Well, I'm sure you
yeah,
can get a clone back if you wanted one, right?
yes, actually, I'm talking to Jason about that, and then hopefully they do move around a little bit. I don't want them to, rip it out or, damage it or damage his reef, but sometimes they do move. He says if one moves into a position where he can get it, then he'd be happy to give me back a clone, a small clone, which would be a lot of fun.
I've never had an anemone in my tank. I think I tried a bubble tip anemone, a red bubble tip anemone, and I think after the first night, it got caught in a power head, and that was that. And that was the last time I ever tried to put an anemone in my reef tank. So, Joe? What kind of advice would you have if somebody wanted to try to, put an anemone in a reef tank, such as the ones that you've had, and you've got one in your tank now? But what kind of advice would you give in terms of, when to put it in, and what kind of anemone, or can it be in an SPS dominant tank? I mean, you obviously have proved that you can do that, and others have as well. But there's others like me that don't know what they're doing when it comes to anemones.
Yeah, yeah, it's for the majority of people, I think that anemones have to be the first thing that goes in before you start to get corals, because you have to let it settle in. It's gonna tend to wander around, and it's very important, as you learned the hard way. Powerheads are a real threat to anemones. Now, this is do as I say, don't do as I do. Because if you look at my tank, I have the tunsies in there, and they're not covered, and the anemone could, in theory, get there. But essentially, what I do to protect from that is I have myself or my wife check the tank each morning and night, and the anemone is quite far. It would take a couple days for it to reach one of the tunsies where they're placed. So we hopefully would have time to see it before it got there. And they're in the quarter, and they tend not to go into those corners. They tend to, if they're going to move, they tend to, at least in my experience, to go towards the overflow. But yeah, bottom line, for most people, it really is very difficult. There's a lot of information online, as with the case with most anything. Do your homework first. But if you have your heart set on an anemone, like I did in the beginning, probably best to start with just a couple corals and let the anemone be one of the early inhabitants, so it can find its place in the rockwork. And if you go online, each type of anemone, the magnificent versus the carpet versus the bubble tip, they all have a preference in terms of lighting and flow and placement. The carpets some of them like to be on the sand substrate and like to burrow in. Bubble tips like to hang sideways, or so everything has a slightly different preferred location and condition, and you definitely want to do your homework before trying an anemone. But I will say, if you're able, it is I find the clownfish anemone relationship to be one that, in terms of the interest generated by people that visit my tank, that is hands down the number one most talked about, most pointed to item in my reef by a large measure.
Well, I'll tell you, I have a similar experience when I have people come to check out my tank. They're not drawn to the SPS. They're drawn to what's moving in the tank, and that's the LPS. So it's like the hammer corals or a torch or whatever it is. And it's a little frustrating. It's like got some awesome SPS corals, great colors and all that stuff. Like, wow, look at that cool like hammer corals. Like, well, that's just kind of like the little window dressing there. But so, I love clownfish too, and luckily, my clownfish do eventually find an LPS to host in. Although the current pair that I have in my tank right now, I bought them. They came in separately because I had a pair, and then I lost one of them, and then I brought another one in. They did not pair up, but and they did not host anything, an LPS, for like at least a year. And then one of them hosted an Alveopora, which was really cool. The other one did not. But then they actually started spawning, and they still don't hang out together. So they spawn like 4 or 5
That's
times.
great.
And so it's nice to be able to like kind of have that symbiotic relationship to you know, with the clownfish and corals. But the anemone clownfish relationship is awesome, and it's so well worth having it if you could pull it off. So Joe, let's switch gears a little bit in terms of you know, what I saw in your tank there, and you also put together a video for us on your equipment room, and we're going to run that as well. But in terms of what we saw in the display tank video, I saw an ATI fixture, right? There's T5s, and is that a T5 LED combo light?
It is, yeah. It's the 8-bulb unit, so eight T5s, and then the 3 sets of LEDs down the middle. And because it's a 48 by 48 tank, I have to have 2 fixtures. It's certainly not a cheap hobby by any means.
Yeah. So talk about your progression to that light fixture. I am still stuck in my ways in terms of the metal halides. I still run a metal halide fixture with 400 watt radiums and T5 combo, and call me stubborn, but it works. You have evolved from that, right? You used to have 400 watt radium 20K bulbs, but you have evolved.
Correct.
I have not evolved.
Yeah, so I've always had a philosophy in my reef, and sometimes I fool myself into thinking I'm doing it, but my philosophy has always tried to be to mimic nature. And so I always wanted to have a soft, you know, dawn, dusk, and a steady progression. That was kind of my dream, to have this progression from low light to the maximum intensity back down to low light in the evening. And with the metal halide, the old my tried and true Hamilton technology,
Yeah.
you know, fixtures that I had in the very beginning, it was, you know, all on, all off. I mean, I did start the VHOs first and then turn the metal halides on, but boy, when they turned on, you went from 0 to 100 and, you know, instantly. And I always longed for something that was more gradual. And so that I actually tried as a kind of intermediate step, I tried a more pure LED light done by Pac Sun, and it had a very strong disco ball effect, and I really didn't care for that. It was, you know, the red, blue, white shining on the sand all the time. And so ultimately, although it was the most expensive option by far, I decided to give a go with the ATI power module, mostly, believe it or not, because I'm trying to think of his name. I think he's Czechoslovakian. Maybe you remember. He just was he just made amazingly beautiful tanks. He was a tank of the month on Reef Central a couple of times. But in any case, he had the ATI fixtures, and he made these gorgeous, gorgeous reefs. So I just couldn't argue with the fact that T5s could do the job. And then when they came out with the power module, now you have the completely controllable, dimmable with the shimmer that I like, because the plain T5, there's no shimmer. And being a metal halide guy, shimmer was very, very important to me. I really enjoyed that fact, another natural looking type environment. And so the ATI power module to me, it's the only one that offers that dawn to dusk process with the shimmer in one package. And I'm very happy with the choice. I would suggest giving it a try the next time you set up a tank, because I think you'd be surprised. And then I also, I've had it now for about 2 years, and it never really looked the same as the old radium metal halide look that I really liked. It was a little bit bluer than that. But recently I don't know why, but I decided to turn up the whites a little bit in the middle of the day. So I ramp up the white LEDs. Before, I had them turned off because I watched a couple of videos on by Bulk Reef Supply about the white not being really necessary for coral growth. Really, it's the lower end. But with the white added in the afternoon, the look that I get, I would now say is really, really, really close to the old radium metal halide look. So I'm very pleased. I'm very, very happy with that choice.
That's quite a statement. I never would have realized that you can try to get close to that with T5s and LEDs, but that's really cool to know. Hey, Joe, K-Dub Corals has a question for you. He's got some ATI Blue Plus bulbs, and he's wondering how high he should mount the bulbs in that fixture. You have any suggestions in terms of how high T5 should be above the tank?
Yeah, there's a gentleman online. He goes by the name Big E. He's on
Yeah.
most of the big forums,
Yeah.
and he was the one who really taught me the most about this topic. And he is a very firm believer that right around that 10-inch level, and his tank only has a 4 bulb unit, and he overdrives them with an ice cap ballast, but he keeps them way up there at 10 inches above the tank. And he shows that you still get a par reading of 200 or more on the 24 inches down. So I would definitely say that at the lowest, he talks about 8 inches. If you have just the T5s, you don't have any LEDs. But especially if you have LEDs in that combination, definitely a higher height, not too low. Definitely something around 10 inches. That's where I keep mine, 10 inches above the water line. The bulb from bulbs to water line is 10 inches.
Have you noticed any difference in terms of colors and growth in your corals when you made the switch from halides to this T5 LED combo?
Yes, I would say that everything in my tank is a slightly deeper color, whatever that color might be. Now, there's a lot more that goes into that, right? Nutrients change and salinity, alkalinity, calcium levels, all of that, the trace elements, etc. We know that there's so much involved, but I do really believe that T5s took my coral coloration to a slightly higher level. Now, the only caveat I would say is that I also enjoy photography. I've done a lot of macro shots of my corals. I cannot quite get the same photograph that I did under radiums. To my eye, it looks more colorful, but in terms of what I can capture with the camera, I don't quite capture that same intense coloration that I was getting before. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of that.
That's interesting. One last question on the display tank, and then I don't know. Should we show the Pico tank, or should we go into the equipment room? Maybe the Pico tank, and then go to the equipment room.
Sure.
And I also want to make sure you've got the time. I know.
Yeah, no rush on my part. I'm here as long as everybody wants to stay listening.
Yeah. So my other question in terms of the display tank, I saw the live rock in there. Is that the same rock you've had in that tank since you started it?
No. So my most recent redo, we were talking about this earlier before the show. I kind of went through a period where well, actually, the truth is I was into another hobby. I was racing cars. And when I was in the race mode, I didn't have a lot of time for my tank, and I started to lose colonies, and then I became very discouraged. So I kind of let my tank go, and it got really overgrown with algae, and I lost a lot of colonies. And when I finally came back around, I stopped racing, and I decided it was time to start over again. I realized that the rock that I had in there probably it was so covered with algae, was covered with dead corals that were really fully encrusted everywhere. I just needed to start out with new rock. So I ended up going with KP Aquatics and getting all new rock. Reef, Keith, I have to beg an absolute pardon for your viewers, and if you can give me 1 minute, I told Keith earlier, unfortunately, I have a gentleman who is doing work here. I have to give him a quick check, and then I'll be right back.
I'm gonna play your equipment room video and maybe the Pico tank video, and hopefully you'll be back by then.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
That'd be perfect. All right.
Here we go.
All right, folks, so here's the messy mad scientist room. No mean comments online. It is very messy, but I've had it this way for about 19 years or so, and it's been working great. So even though it's messy, it does work. Here we go. first thing you'll notice is that I'm a big, huge fan of the Agway stock tanks. That's a 250-gallon stock tank, and that's a 150-gallon stock tank. Obviously, that's my main sump, and this is the tank that I use for water changes. Load it up with 150 gallons of water, and then change it out only about once a quarter now that I have the refugium set up. I don't do water changes as often as I used to. I have, in terms of the only real equipment that I have on the tank, I have an old Neptune Apex system. And right now I'm only monitoring two elements, the temperature and the pH. That's pretty much all I monitor. And as far as filtration goes, I'm very old school. I have a Beckett style skimmer. This is called an HSA 1000. But I've had this for pretty much as long as I've had my Reef set up. And I just love it to death. It's hooked up to a monster pump. It's hooked up to an Iwaki 100. And the amount of water that goes through this every day is just enormous. You can tell I get very good buildup here. And I skim very wet, so I get this full of wet skimmit about twice a week. I have to empty it. So it skims very wet and pulls out a lot of gunk. I really can't say enough about these skimmers. I know today it's very popular to go with the low power needle wheel style skimmers, but I really believe that these things just do an incredible job. The only other addition is recently, because of some videos that I saw done by Bulk Reef Supply, I decided to go ahead and try a refugium. And so I put this on, I don't know, maybe 3 months ago or so. It's got the typical Chaeto morpha algae in there, and I have to take out a ball of algae, I don't know, once a month or so. But again, I just can't say enough about how this system is working. I really like it. I really think it's doing a great job. I have just zero algae problem in my main display tank now that I've set this system up. I did try to do it inexpensively because I had this tank, so the only thing I needed was some sort of overflow, so I went with one of these inexpensive external overflows, and of course, just like everybody else, I did experience a flooding in the basement. Fortunately, the pump only pulls off about 1 inch of water from the sump, so the flood here in the basement was fairly minimal. But as a result, I put on this shutoff, so now if the water level increases too high, it shuts off the pump. But since that flooding, I haven't had any problem with the overflow since then. But that's it. I've got a skimmer and a refugium and a big old sump, and no other chemical filtration at all. So that's Joe Peck's Reef. Thanks for having a look.
Joe, man, that is a real simple, old school setup that you got going there. That skimmer, I used to have that skimmer in my 225-gallon tank, and let me tell you, that thing was a beast, and it did an awesome job.
It really does. I mean, you see today many tanks that have been done showing that you don't have to have a skimmer, but I really think it helps. It certainly helps, and I think it's part of the equation of why I have healthy, colorful corals like I do. I just love that skimmer, love it to death.
You know what I liked about that skimmer is that once you get it tuned in terms of the where that foam is skimming, it does not change. You know, the needle wheel skimmers today, it depends on the water level in the sump, but with those HSA skimmer, right? That is it's an external skimmer, so that's not going to be impacted by the water level in your sump. I mean, the risk is, you can get a leak or something like that, and then you got a bit of a flood wherever your skimmer is. But that's, hey, that's part of the hobby, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting how, I had that skimmer. I have had it now for 19 years, and for probably the first 16, 17 years ago, until 2 years ago when I had some work done in my house professionally, I had some plumbing replaced. I had the skimmer moved, and the gentleman who did the moving, he's a long time, very knowledgeable man that's worked in the hobby, and he changed the way I had it set up myself. I used to have it. It's hard to explain exactly, but it wasn't properly set up, is my point. And so here I am, 17 years into the hobby, learning how to properly set that up. Exactly to your point, though, that once it was set up properly and once I dialed it in correctly, it's amazing how consistent it is. I just get a very, very consistent amount of skimming, cleaning out the overflow there a couple times a week, and I just don't have to mess with it at all, no matter what else is going on in the tank. It's rock solid now. So it's really great.
To me, this is a great example of how you can set up a system without having to spend a lot of money on technology and expensive equipment. I mean, this is a real basic setup, and you pretty much had the same setup since you started the tank, right? I mean, you've made some little changes here and there. You added that the refugium with the Chaeto in there to help provide some nutrients, but to me, just to have a simple basic system and to stick to some standard practices and principles in terms of sound reef keeping, and we could talk more about that, is that's all you need. You don't really need to go crazy and have a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables. And I always say that the more moving parts and variables you have, there's more likelihood that something can go wrong. But technology is a good thing to have, and I'm not going to say anything against it. I mean, I've evolved over the years, and I've leaned on controllers and other pieces of equipment, alkalinity monitors and things like that, and they certainly have their place in the hobby. But also, what you're showing here in terms of what you're doing proves that you can really do this hobby successfully with a very simple setup.
That is absolutely my philosophy. I definitely follow the KISS principle when it comes to my reef. And just like everybody else, I mean, I have gone through my phases over the years. Obviously, having done this for so many years, I tried Zeovid with the little pump of the Zeovid rocks and everything. I've had my reactors on the side. I've had my bubbling the phosphate media. So I've been there, done that, and ultimately I've always come back to, it didn't really help me in the end. Just a simple old skimmer and the sump and the light, and that was all it was really, really necessary.
Joe, before we talk more about your setup, I want to just get a question in from Scott Morrison. He asked a question a little while ago about a suggestion for a fish that's a good workhorse to help clean up algae in his fish tank. What would you recommend in terms of a really good algae eating type of fish for a mixed reef tank?
Well, years ago when I was having a problem with, I think it's called wafer algae. It's like a brown algae that starts to cover your rocks. So I was looking on the internet, and I did a lot of homework and trying to pick what was the most, which fish ate the most variety of bad algae, if it were. And there are many possibilities, but I personally prefer the coal tang. That's the yellow eye coal is one of my favorite fish for kind of an all-around heavy-duty algae eater. I mean, the one I have, boy, he just spends his whole day just scraping away the rock everywhere, all over the tank. So he certainly, and I've had him now for, I think he came from before 07, so I think he's probably 11 or 12 years old.
Wow.
And I got that fish exclusively to eat that brown wafer algae, and he definitely did that in the very beginning, and then some. So yeah, coal tang is my thought.
Yeah, I like to throw a bunch of tangs in my tanks right at the very beginning, because you could put a coal tang and let's say like a yellow tang in different times, because they're not the same kind of shape, tang, not the exact same type of tang. But if you put in a yellow tang and then you wanted to put in a purple tang down the road, that could be a problem. So what I like to do is just put as many tangs in together as possible at the beginning to kind of have a crew, in case one by itself doesn't kind of hold its weight there, pull its weight.
Yeah.
That's always a good thing to do. What else I want to talk about? So, Joe, I didn't notice in the video, and I apologize that I didn't pick this up. But in terms of calcium and alkalinity supplementation, what are you using?
Yeah, I didn't look at that downstairs, but very, very old school B-ionic.
Yep.
My system takes about 230 milliliters of each, part 1, part 2. per day, and I dose it. I have in the sump. I don't know if you saw it, but it is turbulent. I do have a Tunzi in the sump, so I just pour every morning. I go downstairs and pour it in directly. I I've long thought about having a doser. I know everybody uses them. I did try a doser years ago, and of course it got clogged, and it was a hassle to set up, and so I've just been reluctant to go back to add another piece of equipment because it's very easy for me to go down in the morning, or when I'm away on a trip, I have my wife do it for me. But just to pour in 1 cup of Bionic, and that's all it takes. And I wake up in the morning, my pH is 8.0. And then when I dump the 200 milliliters or so, it goes up to 8.2. And for most of the day, it stays at 8.1. So yeah, just good old-fashioned Bionic.
You can't argue with that. Yeah, I'm dosing 2-part now. I've gone back and forth over the years. I started out when I first got into the hobby doing 2-part, and then I did a calcium reactor. And I remember we were talking about in terms of the those early dosers back in the day. They were not very reliable, and they did clog up a lot. But yeah, the dosers that they make today are certainly a lot better and more reliable. But you got to stick with what works. So
yeah, I will also add that I'm actually going to change, and I forget. I should have looked it up before I came on the show, but I've been relying lately heavily on a lot of the BRS, the bulk reef supply videos, because I think they just do a tremendous job of testing equipment and then publishing the results in a very scientific, data-driven way. And so they did an analysis of 2-part solutions, and the conclusion they came to was the powdered variety. I think, but I forget which company it is. It's one of it's on their video, but there's a company that has a powdered version that includes all the trace elements, and it's pretty much identical to Bionic. You just get it in powdered form and have to mix it with RO water, but it's going to be much cheaper because you're not paying to ship water.
Yep.
You're mixing it at home. So I'm going to try that and when I buy them in large, in that big 8-gallon set. So I'm about halfway through a set right now. So when my Bionic runs out, I'm going to try the other new company to see how I like the powdered form.
Talk about nutrient export. So you did add the Refugium recently, and you seem to like it. But what were you doing before that, and why did you make the switch to the Refugium?
So I was probably the biggest expense on my tank after electricity was salt, because I was doing a monthly, even sometimes because if I was doing vacuuming my sump or something, I might even do a bi-monthly 150-gallon water change because I have a pretty big system. And until recently, I actually had a frag tank on that system, which I recently took out, which added another 180 gallons to the system. So I had over 700 gallons in the whole system. So water changes were very expensive. So again, it was a bulk reef supply video where they talked about testing systems that had a Refugium installed, and they found that the Chaeto, if it was properly sized, was actually sufficient to handle nutrient export for reef systems. So it was just a question of getting the combination right. And absolutely, that was my experience. When I got the Refugium up and running well, I suddenly found that my nitrates and phosphates were very low and stable, and I didn't have any more red slime algae on my sand bed. The amount of dust algae that I would get on the glass went down from every day being a problem to being a problem once a week. So I've become a huge fan of adding a Refugium on a larger system. I think it works. It has worked very well for me. And I like it a lot.
What do you like to keep your key parameters at, like alkalinity, calcium, nitrate, phosphate? What do you magnesium? What do you shoot for with those parameters?
So going back to what I mentioned earlier, I try very, very hard to stay as close to natural seawater as you can. Now that's a big question mark there, right? Who's natural seawater? Red Sea or Indian Ocean or Hawaii or what reef am I trying to create? It typically, for me, that means a calcium around 425, alkalinity around 8 degrees Kelvin hardness, temperature around 78, pH around 8.1, salinity I keep at 35 parts per thousand or 1.026 on the refractometer. Magnesium is up around 1250, I think it's around there. And I try to, I no longer test most parameters. The only thing I really test now is calcium, alkalinity, and pH and salinity. That's it. I don't test my magnesium. I don't test my phosphate or nitrate anymore. If I notice something changing, maybe red slime building up, then I'll do a test to see if things are very high. But I don't think that you can get anything more than an order of magnitude indication on your phosphate. The home test kits, I just don't think are accurate enough to really pinpoint it. So I rely more on what I see with my own eye in the tank rather than testing.
That's good advice, because I think it's so very important to observe your tank on a daily basis and not get so hung up on the numbers. So I think observation is absolutely a key thing with reef keeping. You know, if something's not looking right, then kind of like dig a little deeper, but you know, don't overdo it in terms of chasing the numbers. That's I think a good way to approach it. Joe, it's getting close to 6 o'clock. I don't want to keep you too much longer. We got a little video of your Pico tank. You want to show that?
Sure, let's show that just for fun.
All right, let's show that one and take it away.
All right, folks. So here's my 2.5 gallon Pico. The story behind this: I've never had a Pico before, but I recently got an anemone, a new anemone, in the main display, and I tried to create a family of clownfish. And as everyone knows, the chances of that working are slim, and it didn't work. So I ended up with 2 clownfish that were getting beat up. So I decided to find them a home, and this is temporary. I've ordered a 20-gallon tank that I'm going to move them to on a long-term basis. But for now, I had this 2.5 gallon Pico set up because I saw a video done by Worldwide Corals where they set up a 2.5 gallon Pico, and they were doing 100% water changes using water from their reef, and were able to set it up quickly and keep it healthy, even though you can see it's got a pretty heavy load for such a tiny tank. But I think it's just a lot of fun. I'm really excited with it. The only filtration I'm using are the Chemi Pure little combo packs. That's really all I have, plus the water change. And you can tell that it's doing quite well. So that's it. So now let's go head down and take a look at the Mad Scientist room.
All right, we've already taken a look at the Mad Scientist room, so that was pretty cool. Again, that's something that I've always kind of thought about in terms of keeping like a little nano tank like that, and just having a couple of clownfish. It's really a simple setup, and it pretty much looks like it's maintenance free.
Very much so. The key, I think, and I learned from, like I said on the video, I learned from Worldwide Corals video, having another reef in your house where you can, just take water regularly that's, fully biologically active and just do 100% water change and know that you're putting in good water, that makes it very easy. I think if you had just the Pico and you were trying to mix up water and then do a water change and maintain it that way, I don't think it would be nearly as easy.
Yeah. All right, Joe, I got a couple of quick final rapid fire questions for you. Do you have a dream tank? If so, what is it?
I would love to duplicate Steve Weith's tank in a room with that really deep, 8-foot wall on either side. That would be, that was big enough to go diving in. That would be my dream tank for sure. Maybe when I retire, maybe.
There you go. Favorite fish?
I really adore clownfish, and I don't really care for all the new Picasso. I like the classic clownfish. I love the way they breed in your tank. I love the way they behave. I love their stupid swimming, and I love the relationship they form with an anemone.
You already answered this question. Favorite SPS coral is the Oregon Blue Tort.
Yeah. No, hands down. Yep.
All right, if you had to have one piece of equipment as a backup, what would that piece of equipment be?
One piece of equipment as a backup. I'm going to say now a refugium, because I see people with 20-gallon tanks with no skimmer who are just using a refugium. So I'm a new convert. Sign me up. That's my new religion.
Yeah.
Chaetomorph algae.
Yeah, I've been using a Fuge for the last 8 months or so, just experimenting with it because I've never used one. And yeah, they're pretty simple to use. They're great. So, Joe, any final thoughts, any advice to the folks out there watching?
I think the big piece of advice, and I think everybody would agree that's been in this hobby a while, have patience. I saw a guy online recently who had a tank that had really small, he called them sticks. And he said his girlfriend kept coming in and saying, nice sticks. And he was getting frustrated by the fact that people were saying, hey, nice sticks, and he wasn't seeing much. But he'd only had the tank for like 8 months. And in the world of reef keeping, 8 months is not that long.
No.
So patience. Patience is the word for this hobby.
That is great advice. Well, that's going to do it for this show. I really want to give my sincere thanks to Joe for being my guest on the live stream tonight. Joe had a lot of fun. And so, folks.
And vice versa.
Yeah,
thanks.
So, folks, next Thursday at 7 p.m. is going to be my next live stream. And it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm going to have Tulio Dell'Aquila from Reef Bright on, and he is incredibly knowledgeable about lighting, and it's going to be a very enjoyable and interesting conversation. So you will not want to miss Tulio next Thursday at 7 p. But until then, take it easy and stay safe out there.